Everybody knows that the birthplace of karate is Okinawa, but few people know that there's a big difference between Okinawan karate and Japanese karate. So in today's video, I want to reveal 10 differences that I discovered while living in the birthplace of karate. Check it out. Okinawan karate tends to have higher stances than Japanese karate. And the reason is simple, because the original purpose of karate was self-defense, and low, deep stances are simply not practical, but they do build a lot of strength and stamina. But that is not the purpose of the higher stances, which are more easily accessible if you actually have to use your movements in a real fight. And if you look at the first Okinawan karate pioneers that came to Japan back in the days, their stances were significantly higher than those of their students and subsequently the rest of the world. The second difference is why over how. You see, the Japanese karate is very focused on how to do things the right way, especially when it comes to biomechanics. On the other hand, Okinawan karate is more concerned with why you're doing something. That's why you often hear the word imi being used in Okinawa, which literally translates to meaning, because the functional applications, also known as bunkai, is much more important than the technical specifics of how you execute the movements. And the reason for this is because the purpose of a lot of karate stuff was lost during the modernization of karate in mainland Japan. And if you don't know the why, it's more easy to focus on the how, because Japanese karate is less about self-protection and more about self-perfection. It became a pathway to enlightenment, just like Aikido or Judo or Kendo. It became Karate Do, the way. The third difference is a word called os, which you almost never hear in Okinawa, but it's super popular in Japan, especially in the Kyokushin style. And it even spread to the West. Today you hear this os word being used both in MMA gyms and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools, but it's almost never heard in Okinawa. And that's because it's actually considered rude to say os, especially to someone who's of higher rank than you, because it's a very macho term that mostly young men use, especially those who compete in karate. The Okinawans prefer to either just shut up and train or use the word hai, which just translates to yes. Like I mentioned, Okinawan karate is not exactly a sport. It's much more of a lifestyle. Like one of my friends in Okinawa once told me, karate is part of our cultural identity, and that is the key. But don't get me wrong, there's a lot of reverse influence these days, and modern sports-based Japanese karate is even practiced in Okinawa these days. Actually, there are even world champions in Okinawa. But most Okinawan karate is more of a lifestyle choice, and that's why they can practice it their whole lives, because the karate grows with you, rather than the competitive version of karate where you simply get too old and you can't keep up with the young competitors and athletes anymore, because a growing bamboo doesn't compete with the bamboo next to it. Next, I want to teach you a word called chinkuchi, which is what the Okinawans use instead of kime, which is a Japanese word. Now, we all know that kime is that split-second moment of impact where you want to tense your whole body and have that full-body isometric neuromuscular contraction at the moment of impact. But the Okinawans have something called chinkuchi instead of that. Chinkuchi is expansion, not contraction. Sometimes I teach people who practice a lot of Japanese karate and they're really good at stopping their techniques, which becomes a problem when I ask them to punch through something and transfer their power, because they're so used to contracting instead of expanding. In other words, you don't want to freeze your technique. You don't want to lock it out. You want to hit through your opponent, which creates a shock wave known as atifa in the Okinawan language. You see, the Okinawans have a lot of these old words that don't even exist in Japanese karate, like muchi-mi or gammaku. The list goes on. Because Okinawan karate is supposed to be functional. That's why it doesn't always look pretty and sharp, but it definitely works. Like an Okinawan sensei once told me, the ugliest karate, sometimes the best. Kobudo is the ancient art of using karate's weapons. You see, although Japanese karate is mostly empty-handed, in Okinawa, almost every dojo has weapons on the walls. And that's because originally, karate and kobudo were like brother and sister. They should always go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin, because unless you know how to use a weapon, you'll never be able to defend yourself against one. Critics love to say that nobody will ever carry a sai or tonfa or nunchaku in real life, but what they don't understand is that all of the weapons represent basic, common attributes of tools in your surrounding in everyday life. If you know how to use the kobudo weapons, you can use anything as an extension of your body to defend yourself. And again, self-defense was the original purpose of karate, and that's why kobudo is still so popular in Okinawa. Good karate requires not just technique, but also physique. And that's why Okinawan karate is heavily focused on strengthening the body. Now, although Japanese karate also incorporates a lot of strength training, the Okinawans love to use old school tools, like this one here, known as the chi-ishi, which literally comes from the words chikara, meaning power, and ishi, which means stone. In other words, it's a stone weight on a stick that helps you develop that core stability needed for power. But there are tons of other strength training tools as well, like the ishisashi, the stone padlock, which is very similar to the modern day kettlebell, or the nigirigame, jars filled with sand that strengthen your grip. And what all of these different strength training tools have in common is that they improve attributes and skills that actually help your karate, because strength is a skill if you practice it the right way. Here's another Okinawan word for you, tuidi, or what the Japanese call torite, which refers to the seizing, grabbing, twisting, and dislocating of joints. In other words, stand-up grappling. You often see this being practiced in Okinawan sensory flow drills, also known as kakie, where you will push hands, similar to what you sometimes see in Wing Chun or Kung Fu. And the reason the Okinawans love tuidi is because old school karate was actually a close-range fighting skill, something you had to use in self-defense when you couldn't escape from your opponent. But Japanese karate changed the ma'ai, the engagement distance, to a longer distance, where grabbing and stand-up grappling and wrestling was simply not as important anymore. And that's why Japanese karate focuses heavily on long-range techniques, while Okinawan karate uses short-range fighting much more, including tuidi. And that's why many Japanese practitioners don't realize how to apply the kata techniques in a real fight, because you're looking at the wrong range, the long range. Individualization is the Okinawan way. Mass training is the Japanese way, because when old school karate came to mainland Japan, they started to teach it at the universities to big groups of students. This is why so many movements were exaggerated so they could easily be seen by many people. Imagine if you're standing at the back of a group being taught a kata. Unless the movement is big and exaggerated, you're not really gonna see what's going on. But an Okinawan dojo is actually quite small. You can maximum fit 10 or 15 people, and even fewer back in the days. That's why a sensei would have very few students and quite rarely could actually make a living from teaching karate. But what they could do was give you individual, unique, specific attention to detail so that you could elevate your skills, unlike the Japanese mainland karate, where it was more about quantity instead of quality, because that level of specialization is simply not possible when you teach big groups of students. For this reason, some old Okinawan karate styles almost died out because they lacked the students needed to pass on the tradition. Luckily, the mass training of Japanese mainland karate helped spread the art to the rest of the world. Lastly, let's talk about the dojo atmosphere. In an Okinawan dojo, you're almost never afraid of anybody. But in a Japanese dojo, it's often a kill or be killed mentality. The training is much more serious. If an Okinawan karate class starts at 7 o'clock, some students will drop in at 7:15, 7:30, 8, 8:30. It doesn't really matter. It's like you have this 2-hour window where you can just come and go as you please. And the sensei will be there during that time to explain stuff and give you details. But in a Japanese dojo, you're never allowed to be late. It is super strict when training starts and stops. because the atmosphere is not as laid back. Perhaps that's one of the reasons the Japanese became so good technicians, because they take this stuff really seriously. And that's why Okinawan karate is so good for a lazy bastard like me who's never on time. But at the end of the day, it's about doing what you love, whether that's Japanese karate, Okinawan karate, Korean karate, or European karate. And if you want to learn more about the roots, culture, and history of karate, check out some of my other videos for much more. Thank you so much for watching. Train hard, good luck, and have fun.